So on my left is Nick Lochner. Now, some of us may know last year about Alan Jones's comment at a Young Liberals function where he said that perhaps Julia Gillard's father died of shame. I don't know if that rings a bell with anyone, but Nick was the gentleman who started the Stop Alan Jones campaign, and we're going to hear more about that shortly. And last year, Nick was named one of Sydney's 100 most influential people by the Sydney Magazine for his work in this social media campaign. I don't know whether you've slid down the ranks this year, Nick, but we might have to work on that. On Nick's left is Ed Santow. Ed joins us for today's panel, and Ed is the CEO of the Public Interest Public Interest Advocacy Centre, known as PIAC for short. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, we might from here on in say PIAC. A policy organisation promoting human rights and social justice, which also we'll hear more about. And on his left, Malcolm Wood. Malcolm's had about 30 years or so experience in the financial sector, working currently for Morgan Stanley, Head of Investment Strategy for their wealth management team. And Malcolm, in particular in this context, serves on the board of International Care Ministries that does work in the Philippines amongst the slum communities. So that's our panel for today. But let me just say a few quick words to get us into the sort of mode for today's forum. I don't know about you, but my experience has been that it's hardly possible to go in a day in the city without walking past someone who is seeking help, perhaps asking for money, and sadly, typically, it's often the same people. Or perhaps you've had the experience of watching your favourite TV show, perhaps Downton Abbey or something like that, and you're rudely interrupted by a picture of someone who is in desperate need, perhaps a child from Africa or Asia or another developing country, and you feel perhaps hopeless. How can you make a difference? How can you help such a person on the other side of the globe? Well, perhaps with those sorts of thoughts in mind, we're asking the question, how can we make a difference? And that's what we're going to be focusing on with our panel. So I thought I'd start with Nick here. Nick, I read on the web that really you almost stumbled into this campaign by chance. Can you just enlighten us as to how that came about?
Yeah, of course. So being young people, we're often quite engaged, obviously, with things like social media. So it was the night before the campaign actually sort of happened, where it started, and the Telegraph's front page was leaked online by a friend, and I was able to obviously get a bit of a preview as to what Alan Jones had said at the Sydney University Young Liberals event. And it was more a combination of things that sort of led to us deciding that we were going to set this up. So it was, Alan's constant comments, reprehensible comments, the fact that, as a young person, I'm living in what is the most toxic political environment in Australian history. And it's about how we're told as young people that we, have all these opportunities available to us and to make the most of those. And too often, we feel like we can't because we're put in a position like what we had in the last Parliament and the Parliament before, and what could be the next 3 years, where very little gets done. There's very little, positive sort of outlook. So it was more out of frustration that Vinay Orakondi, a classmate of mine, and I started that. Started off as a Facebook page and sort of snowballed into a petition a few hours later, and off
got
it
some
went.
100,000 or so signatures?
Yeah, 116,000 in the end. So.
Yeah, okay, right. And I think, did you say at one point you even had more subscribers than listeners to Alan Jones's program?
That's correct, yeah.
Okay,
So.
Yeah. Well, we might come back to the merits or otherwise of such a campaign, and keen to hear your thoughts and questions through the SMS or Twitter, and please do send them through, and I'm getting them here and I can pose them to the panel. Ed, so there's perhaps a little bit of a overlap here, but you've taken on this role of CEO of PIAC. I read that PIAC is a law and policy organisation working for a fair, just and democratic society. It sounds very grand. How do you see your organisation is making a difference?
Well, we are a human rights organisation, and I guess the central animating idea for human rights is the idea that you need to protect the dignity of everyone as individuals and also as a community. And that's an idea that doesn't just animate I guess the secular institutions that like the UN that support human rights, but is very powerful across many world religions. So it's a really, really important idea. Then we have to translate that into the messy, dirty, practical day-to-day life of living in a community like Australia. So to give an example, we do test case litigation. That's what we're best known for. We ran a case successfully earlier this year. Our client was a wonderful man by the name of Graham Innes, who happens to be blind. That case was about accessible public transport, so making sure that our public transport is able to be used, in this case, by people who are blind. Graham's particular problem was that he catches the train to work each day, but in Sydney, unlike most other cities in the world, we don't have regular, reliable, audible announcements on trains. So, you know, when you get into Town Hall Station, it should simply say Town Hall. But in about 1 in 5 trains, when Graham started his case, that just didn't occur. So we took that on as a case, and we were ultimately successful, and we've seen a really positive change. And that really is fundamental. I mean, Graham's ability to go to work is fundamental to his dignity, and his ability to catch public transport is fundamental to him being able to go to work.
Yeah,
crucial.
It's a great example. It gives us a good picture of your work, and we'll come back to the sort of clients that you do serve, because I think that'll be important to hear. And Malcolm, so banker, international career, Hong Kong, New York. Why International Care Ministries? How did you stumble across that?
Well, Peter, I'd been interested in business solutions for poor people, and an organisation I ran into when I lived in New York was Opportunity International, and then went to which provides loans, microfinance, small loans to poor people. And then when we moved to Hong Kong in 2005, I met a guy from Morgan Stanley, my organisation, and another Australian from Macquarie Bank, and they were involved with this ministry called ICM. And they challenged me not just to think about the poor being one group, but there's a whole raft of people for whom microfinance doesn't work below that. And so got engaged with ICM, and ICM's target audience is the poorest of the poor. So we're talking here people earning less than 50 cents a day. So very, very poor people.
Right. Okay, and we'll no doubt hear a little bit more, some personal stories of that. In fact, it might actually at this point be interesting to hear how did it actually begin? How did ICM begin?
Yeah, so ICM began in the early 90s. It's a bit of a Hong Kong story, but I think we can all relate to it. A lady called Sharon Tan, Chinese lady, she was supporting the family of her Filipino helper. A lot of families in Hong Kong have a Filipino maid who will do the washing, ironing, cooking, all that sort of thing. And she was intrigued to find out what they were doing with the money. And so the story is that Sharon was an interior designer working on high-end apartments in Hong Kong. And the day before she went to the Philippines to see what was going on, she rejected this marble, this Italian marble bathroom setting because of one little chink in the marble. Jumped on a plane, went to the Philippines, and saw people, on death's door, extraordinarily poor people on death's door, and was just blown away. And that was the genesis for ICM.
Do you think, Ed, just picking up on that disparity between the rich and the poor, we don't presumably have that extremes in Australia, but is that something you're also seeking to address in terms of a fair or just society?
I think so. I mean, you're right that the level of disparity in Australia is perhaps not as acute as in some other countries, but it is getting worse. I mean, our largest project provides free legal advice and assistance for people who are homeless. And that's, I guess, a community in Australia that is much larger than many people realise. There's about 100,000 people who'll be homeless tonight.
All right. So, Nick, we might come back to the campaign, because I think there's a lot that we can sort of learn from this. Perhaps first, just from a personal perspective, what was your underlying motive to do this? Presumably you weren't expecting to become one of the most 100 influential people. So what was your motive in starting this?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned before, the sort of initial reaction was obviously one of frustration. I've always had a strong sense of social justice. I traded in a degree in accounting and financial management in order to do a Bachelor of Arts in politics. So
a big career move.
Big career move. But for me, it's always been about a strong sense of social justice. And so, as a young person, again, my parents have always said that, you can be whatever you want to be, use the opportunities that are available to you. You're incredibly lucky to obviously live in Australia. And when I look around Australia, there's so much that I see that, as much as we say how great the country is, there's so much that we see that's wrong. And Ed obviously just mentioned there, when you've got 100,000 people in a country like ours who go homeless every single night, there is an issue that needs to be addressed. And my understanding of all of those sorts of things are, who do we place as the number one people? Who do we give trust to solve those issues? And they're usually the people that we look up to as role models, our leaders, our elected representatives, people like that. And so when we need to operate in that system and when we don't, as young people, we're often disenfranchised. I've mentioned this before about how young people are the largest sector of unemployed in Australia. And they're also the largest number of people that are coming out as graduates out of universities looking for jobs. So when we've got that sense of disenfranchisement, we're looking for solutions. And when we've got a climate where everything's consistently negative, reaching those solutions is often very, very difficult. And so I'm a huge proponent of transparency and accountability when it comes to these sorts of discourses. And a core tenet of our campaign was promoting positive public discourse.
Yes.
So
in a way, giving a voice to people who otherwise wouldn't be heard was a key motivation.
That's exactly right. As young people, we're often not heard. Everyone, and the great thing about social media, and that part of the reason we kept it in social media, is that everyone has one voice there. Your opinion is no more valid or invalid than the person next to you. And so those traditional ideas of wealth and power, those constructs that we operate in as a society get broken down on social media. Yeah. And so as young people, that's how we engage, that's how we communicate, and that's the whole point behind it, is that we're able to transfer information, analyse information and consistently create these sorts of cycles without having to operate inside that traditional power structure. And that gives us a voice. We united 116,000 people with ultimately what was one voice saying, enough is enough, we want positive discourse, we want to make progress. Yeah. And these were people across different ethnic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, and for us, most importantly, political and age backgrounds.
Yes.
So that was huge when we were able to unite those sorts of demographics.
Yeah, wonderful. And so, Ed, do you feel this theme of giving people a voice, do you feel that is an issue for us in Australia? One of your objectives is a democratic society. Do we have a voice?
Look, I think it's something that needs always to be worked on further, and I think Nick's absolutely right that young people a group that are often forgotten. They're easily lumped together. I used to be a young person once myself. I'm sure many of you were too. But it's easy to forget what it was like to lack the power that goes on with being young. I mean, give a very, very quick example. We're running a big class action at the moment on behalf of young people who were unlawfully detained by the New South Wales Police as a result of very long-running IT glitch in their computer system. The effect on a young person to be detained, the effect of being detained, especially if they're detained overnight, can be the most life-changing experience in the worst possible way you can ever imagine. We have day-to-day contact with our clients who are in this class action, and we've seen to our horror the way in which many of their lives have deteriorated. All the research shows that really negative experiences like that, and I readily can see that's an extreme version of a negative experience, but really negative experiences like that as a young person can really shape your life in the worst possible way. But to be more optimistic, really positive experiences when you're young, and I'm the beneficiary of a whole series of positive experiences when I was growing up and at school and university, can really allow people to flourish, and I guess that's what we have to work towards.
Yeah. So Malcolm, in the sort of work that ICM does, I mean, giving these poor people a voice is a dream. Your needs are even much more fundamental, aren't they? Give us a feel for the sort of holistic approach that ICM has to people who live in such dire circumstances.
Yeah, Peter, we think that you need to address a broad range of issues for these folks. So our core program we call Transform. And there's 3 elements to that, and there's an annual report up the back, and you can get all the detail on this if you like. But the first is values. We think that giving a message of love and hope to these people is absolutely vital. If you're in a situation where you don't have enough food to put on the table every day, you can imagine that your self-esteem's probably taking a bit of a battering at the same time. Secondly, we have adapted a UN health program, and we teach that. That's been extraordinarily successful. So it's a lot of it's preventative, because these people can't get access to the health system realistically. Preventative health skills, and then thirdly, and part that I've been more involved with, is in the livelihood area, and these folks are too poor to have to get a microfinance loan, but we teach basic skills. And in the areas of container farming, vermiculture, household products, food products, and again, it's remarkable the outcomes we get. Because we're business guys, we want to do this very efficiently, and we measure everything we do, and the results are pretty impressive. So we're continuing to grow it, and our ambition is to really make a difference in the provinces where we're operating.
Wonderful. Well, one of the things I'd like to explore with each of you, and please do send through comments here or questions, I'd like to explore, do you really need to get your hands dirty if you want to make a difference? If we're all thinking here about what can we do, in your experiences, does it really take either your time, your money, what sort of involvement or sacrifice is required to make a difference? Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's very unique when you run things through social media or online. We got criticised, obviously, for being keyboard warriors, and it's so easy just to sign something online. But my argument to that is quite simply, when you're passionate about something, and this is probably where I'm going to have to disagree with you on the question. Sure. When you're passionate about something, it is not a sacrifice. And so when it comes down to things like time and money and energy and all of that, we were putting in 16-hour days, plus I work full time, plus I have to study and cricket training and all the rest of it on top of it. Some point have a social life. So when you've got all of that on top, and you're still functioning, and you're still sleeping, and you're still have great life satisfaction because you get up every day and you're doing something great. It's not a sacrifice at all. In terms of getting your hands dirty, I suppose that's probably a little bit more relevant for these two, I suppose, because most of our work indeed was done behind a computer and in front of cameras. But for the most part, I think the tenets are the same. If you're passionate and you love it, then
you did have to call a halt to your university degree. So in some sense, you did have to say, well, I'm willing to sacrifice something to achieve an end.
True, but again, I mean, it's for me, again, I'm lucky. I live in Australia where I can come back to that degree. And so postponing it isn't really sacrificing it. Yeah. It's something that probably most students wish that they could do more often. Just put off all your essays until next semester. But no, for me, again, it's the same thing. I don't consider anything that I did a sacrifice. And I think that any reasonable person who was in that same position probably would have done the exact same thing.
And what about you, Ed? You've had a career in private practice, in law, academia. What was the transition like to work for a not-for-profit? Don't know what the tenure is there like, the security. How do you see it?
Look, I mean, 10 years ago I was a commercial lawyer and I enjoyed it very much. But I tend to agree with Nick that the satisfaction that I derive from my job is fantastic and is a really significant compensation for the job. I also sometimes say to my wife that if the cost of the psychiatrist bills, if I was still at the commercial law firm, would really add up, and maybe the difference between the two wages. But there are costs, and frankly, they're borne more by my colleagues than by me. I tend to kind of come in and do a lot of management and hog some of the glory. But the people that are working at the coalface day to day, issues such as I guess, vicarious trauma, that is experiencing an aspect of the trauma of some of our clients, are very real. And so not just within our organisation, but within our sector, there's a very high burnout rate. And that's something we're really conscious of and we do try and address, but at some level, that is inescapable. And so I think it does take a toll on people.
Yeah. So, Malcolm, I know in the model of ICM, the work is distributed or disseminated, if that's the right term, through pastors who actually live in these slums.
Yes.
So, in a very real sense, they're getting their hands dirty, aren't they?
Oh yes, these guys are extraordinary, men and women. So we partner with about 3,000 pastors in these slum communities, and in many instances these guys are educated and they've given it up, literally, to plonk themselves and their family in a place where there's no electricity, no running water, no sanitation, etc., etc. So extraordinary people. And a program like ICM can be transformational for their communities. So they're great advocates for us. But in terms of sacrifice, I think what I do pales into insignificance by comparison.
Though you have visited it firsthand,
oh, yeah.
and that no doubt has had an impact on you. Perhaps tell us the story of when you visited the work firsthand.
Yeah, so on my second visit there, I went with the whole family, and we went. There's a variety of different slums. So you've got your urban slum, which we often see with people crammed in wherever they can in sort of shacks. Then we've got fishing villages, which are often very poor as well. But the poorest areas in regional Philippines where we are is the rural slums. And so this particular community was sort of attached to a sugar plantation. And unfortunately, I guess it's some sort of post-colonial hangover. There's they're almost indentured labourers to the owner of the sugar plantation. So we went to this very poor community, saw the work of ICM, and then I said to the ICM guy, can we just go for a visit through the community, see some of the houses that people live in? And so we did that, and literally the first one we went to, it was a bamboo hut. They call them nipper huts, and dirt floor, no electricity, no water, etc. And went into the dimly lit place, and mother's there with this baby who was in serious problems. And my wife was, we got to get this kid to a hospital now. And so I sort of pulled out some money and gave it to the ICM person, and then we sort of went on, sort of a bit shaken, but we went on with your activities for the day. And then we jumped on a plane, flew back to Hong Kong, you're back into your first world life, and heard the news the following day that the little fella didn't make it. He passed away. And sad to say that this is a reality. Most of the people, most of the women that are recipients of ICM have kids who pass away. Infant mortality is a serious issue. So that's really confronting, and motivating as well.
So, Ed, you may be not faced with quite that degree of perhaps injustice even or poverty, but your work clearly is looking to help those who are most vulnerable in our society. From a biblical perspective, I think there's good reason to think that the mark of our maturity as a society is how we treat the most vulnerable. Would you think that's true?
Look, I do think it's true. I think it's also important to realise that at some stage in your life, you're going to be vulnerable. Everybody's vulnerable as a child. You're also very vulnerable if you're old, if you get sick. So we all, there's I guess an aspect of enlightened self-interest as well in living in a society and having a kind of a community around us that is welcoming and that is willing to help when you're in need. I sometimes think of my own father, who was, really quite a powerful person. He was a very, successful lawyer, and he did very well in his life. But I remember the last few months of his life, his vulnerability, the fact that he was very ill for the last few months, and he was entirely reliant on the nurses at the hospital where he was being taken care of. And I remember being struck, very, very kind of emotional level by that vulnerability. And anyone's father probably is someone that you kind of continue to, even in adulthood, see as being at some level invincible, but then suddenly one's not. And I think that's something that's really, really important to remember.
It's not a problem out there, it's a problem that's really for all of us to face.
Yeah, and I think that the more in which we see that as a shared problem and one that we're all party to, I think the more likely it is that we'll internalise the problem and also the solution.
Well, we've got a couple of questions on that. How can we address today the what's in it for me spirit? How can we address apathy? What's the point of trying to make a difference? I think these questions are all trying to sort of get at, how can I start? How can I actually make a difference? And what would you encourage someone who's, say, in your demographic, what should I do to want to make a difference?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, particularly for young people going forward, is to make sure that we're still working towards overcoming that sort of disenfranchisement we've had, particularly in the past, and still kind of pushing through that now. So there is obviously a sense to go, what's the point? But at the same time, you're saying, I've got the next. By the time I, hit even retirement age, I'll probably be at this year, now's life expectancy. So I've still got 60, 70, 80 years of my life to sort of go through. I've got a lot of time to make small bits of change here and there and things like that. So again, you're taking these opportunities that pop up in front of you. You're definitely making a stand about what you believe in and what you're passionate about. I think this is the most important thing about anyone who wants to make a difference, is to find what you're passionate about, knowing who you are, and finding an organisation or even starting an organisation like Ed's done and that Malcolm's joined and things like that you can actually pursue those sorts of objectives alongside all the sorts of other things you have to do in your life. So I think if you're passionate and you know who you are, that's gonna happen naturally. And in reference to that comment about what's in it for me, honestly, it's about fulfilling your potential as a human being for me. That's what I get out of all of that, is that there is probably no material gain. I get my name on a list for a year that ultimately means nothing. But it's about, as a human being, there is nothing that separates myself from anyone else.
Yeah.
And so, when we revert back to what is natural, it's, being, just human.
Yeah.
And I think that making a difference and being passionate about those things is fulfilling that potential. There is no material gain.
Picks up on what Ed said earlier about the dignity of each individual. But Malcolm, similar sort of question. From your perspective as a Christian, you have had many privileges, your background, your current job. How do you see this responsibility playing itself out in your life?
Responsibility. I do think that we need to, as Christians, we need to take the responsibility of looking after the vulnerable and poor very, very seriously. And so, one of the motivations has to be in serving the poor, obeying Christ's command to do that.
But in terms of your sort of stewardship of your resources and talents, how do you see your responsibility as an individual playing out?
Oh, well, in those terms, actually, some of you may have heard a line by John Wesley, something along the lines of, earn all you can, save all you can, give away all you can. And I'm not saying that I do that perfectly, but I think, as a banker, and you can all stand here and say, well, what's this guy doing earning the money and, really, does he really make a difference? I think that's one way we can square the circle, which is we have been given great privilege and opportunity. We can leverage that to challenge people to join us. And there's nothing better than to take a friend to the slums of the Philippines and show them and to get them engaged in this, because I think, as the guys are saying here, you find that the benefits from that, oh gosh, I am making a difference. One at a time, can really vitalise and change people's lives. And those sort of cynical, sort of charred bankers can sort of get a bit of life again.
Yeah.
So it's all those sort of motives.
Well, I think one of the themes running through is this grassroots, take the long-term view, one-by-one support. If we all have that attitude, we can collectively make a big difference.
Yes.
I guess, though, just want to put you a little bit more on the spotlight here, though. How can you reconcile your job, which is to make wealthy people wealthier in asset management, and visiting the slum in the Philippines? Is that reconcilable?
Oh, I guess it comes back to it's not my responsibility as to how other people use their resources, but I can certainly show my experience. So all the guys at work know that I'm going to the Philippines for the week, and we run a kids camp every year for some of the kids, and do some board meetings, all that sort of stuff. And I get a couple of tables to our annual banquet from work, so people can engage in this. You don't have to sort of say, well, I'm over here and
so you're modelling it to others.
I think there's that, and in that sense, I think I sit in a position where I can be a positive influence over people making, as you say, lots of money. What are they going to do with that? That makes a difference. So part of it is my sense that I've been privileged. I've got the resources and the skills to make a difference. Why not? And I'm in a position where I can be generous and model that. And hopefully it just brings one or two people along with me.
Do you think philanthropy is on the rise in this country?
I do so. I do. Yes, I do believe that. The government started these structures called private ancillary funds. I guess it's 5-10 years ago now. And they generally have about $1 million of assets in them, and I think there's more than 1,000 of those that have been created in the last 5-10 years. So somebody's doing something, and they are required by law to give all their at least 5% of their assets away annually to charities.
Okay, wonderful. Ed, I might try to, if you don't mind, put you a little bit more on the spot here. We've got a question here about, the human animal, the human being. How can we seriously say that they have rights? Where do these rights come from? And in a similar vein, I guess I was thinking, with your aim to address rights and systemic unmet needs, etc., what is your benchmark? What's your frame of reference to determine what needs to be met and what are rights?
Well, I mean, I guess that it's a very difficult question to answer quickly, but...
You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, okay. I might go back to where I started, which is, for me, I think both on a secular and a religious level, the protection of individual dignity is where I think that's the touchstone from which human rights kind of flourish. Every human right, such as freedom of expression, the right to freedom of association, the right to life, all of these rights all go back to protecting aspects that are necessary for an individual to live a dignified life. And so for me, I think that's really crucial. The first part of the question that, I guess comes from the fact that humans are animals and we don't accord the same level of protection to other animals. It's true. It's hard to come up with a really principled basis for why we do that. But that would be, I think, a very difficult thing to challenge, and certainly I don't intend to do that right now. What I can say, though, is that I think at a very basal, visceral, observational level, if you see someone who is struggling, if you see someone whose rights are not being protected, for most of us, that will have an impact. For most of us, you will feel at some kind of level, without even engaging your rational brain, that something's not quite right. And I guess our challenge is to find out what role we can all play in addressing those wrongs.
So there is, in a very simple level, a gut instinct that we have. And perhaps, I don't know if you see it, Malcolm, this way, but from a biblical perspective, the idea that men and women have been made in the image of God, I guess, is a source of dignity that might motivate what ICM is doing.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the, when I mentioned the Transform program and we teach values, well, that's absolutely one of the values we're teaching These people that just because you're down and out does not mean you don't have value in God's eyes. You are very important to him. Very important. So, and you know, actually, hope is an amazing quality. We track the outcomes of our programs, and I cannot rationally explain why we get the results we do. It's got to be something to do with the human spirit turning round and doing more than, you know, our program would say they should be able to do. So I think hope and telling people they have dignity, you do matter, has tangible impacts in a place like the Philippines when you're sort of hanging on by and I'm sure there's many other places in the world in similar circumstances. So it can make a major difference.
Well, we're actually just going to have to wrap up in a moment, but I must ask just a couple of closing remarks from the panel. General question to close, and feel free to say what you wish. How have your experiences in the various ways in which you have sought to make a difference shaped you, and perhaps shaped now what you're seeking to do in the future, Nick?
Yeah, really, really important for me, obviously, because I'm still studying and hoping to eventually, you know, enter the workforce. So I have to make a decision at some point. But you know, for me, I spent a little bit of time in 2012. I ran as an independent candidate for local government. So again, standing up saying, young people are here, we're ready to do things, we want to be engaged, let us in. And so I'd like to be able to go back and have a look at that sort of aspect of my life, have a look at, you know, what can I do in terms of policy development, maybe. I'd love to work in international aid and development, which would be great. So I spent a little bit more time doing that. But, you know, I would like to say this, if I can. What matters for us as well going forward is to ignore the sort of the last 6 years, basically, last 6 to 9 years of Australian politics, because I think that for us, if you're mentioning about instilling hope and the human spirit, we delegate a certain amount of power to people in Canberra or up onto Macquarie Street there, and we give them a certain amount of responsibility. And for a large number of people, that's where their engagement ends. And I'd like to encourage them to actually engage themselves back in that process, because politicians don't tell you, and they shouldn't be allowed to tell you what you believe and what you think, right? You are there and you're individuals, you can make up your own minds on what the facts are and come to a reasoned interpretation of that. And you should be the ones that are telling your politicians, this is what we believe as a society, this is what I want to see happen, and these are the changes that I want. And very often than not, and if you start doing that, you're going to find it does not fall along party lines. So you might call yourself a Labor supporter, but when you start doing that and engaging with what is there, you might find that there are some things on the right that you agree with, and vice versa. And honestly, I think that's important, because you only reach decisions and make positive outcomes as a society when you're working cooperatively and positively and proactively together. And when that discourse is that healthy, you know, that's when you're going to find the results you want.
Well, it sounds very refreshing to hear. It'd be lovely if our political landscape followed that path. What about perhaps the final word from you, Ed? In light of your experiences, how do you see the work of PIAC playing out, and the sorts of things you'd love to develop and see towards a just and fair society?
As a little kid, I wanted to be a doctor, and only problem was I was terrible at science, and I hated science. So I guess I had some kind of disposition to be a doctor, but I was actually much better at law, which is incredibly dull. It's even more dull than you may imagine. But what becoming a lawyer did was it gave me a set of tools. And I guess what I've been trying to do, and what my organisation PIAC allows me to do, is find a way in which I can use the tools of the law to help people in much the same way that I think doctors do, or I always imagine doctors to do. And so that's I guess what I'm keen to continue doing, to find other ways that the law can be used to protect the basic rights that allow people to live in dignity.
Thank God for lawyers. Will you please join me in thanking this panel?